So I'd like to read two texts kind of back to back and reflect a little bit on that as we're launching our conversation. Turn, if you would, to Genesis chapter 11. Actually, we might as well start with Genesis chapter 10, verse 32. And then also keep your finger in the book of Acts, in the New Testament, chapter 2, verse 1. So, yeah, that's what we're going to do right up there. Genesis 10:32 through. Yeah. All right. Use that one. Try this one. There we go. Genesis 10:32 through 11:9, and Acts 2:1 through 12. Right. And do we have a couple of volunteers to stand up and read each of these texts? Somebody to read the Genesis and somebody to read the Acts. Outstrung for our camera beaming to 40 nations along there's a trailer to Billy Graham here. Who would like to read?
I will.
Great, stand up. We got a Genesis reader. Do we have an Acts reader?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Hear the word.
These are the families of Noah's sons, according to their genealogies, in their nations. And from these nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over all the face of the earth.
When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind and filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues, as of fire, appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. At this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All are amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, 'What does this mean?'"
Thank you. What does this mean? What does this mean? Have you ever wondered what the divided tongues meant? I believe you have that symbol in the Uniting Church, don't you? Somewhere on your logo? Inherited from the Methodists, isn't there something of a divided flame, divided tongue in the logo?
The dove.
It's a Pentecostal symbol. Pentecostals make you all nervous. What does it mean? What is the relationship between the Babel story and the Pentecost story? Do you see any connections? They're not usually read together, of course. They're not usually seen to have much to do with each other. And yet they both have to do with tongues. Don't they? What's the connection?
Going to seeds and people speaking different languages. Each for a different reason.
What's the different reason?
One to communicate in acts and one to not communicate or to cause confusion.
How can it be that linguistic diversity in one case is for purposes of not communicating, whereas linguistic diversity in the second case would be for purposes of communicating? How do you figure?
Well, the first one is trying to stop something happening that God didn't want happening in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one is to try and spread the message and proclaim Pentecost.
Or so we've been taught.
Yep.
So goes the usual reading of such texts. But on the surface, are they really about different things? Peter's right. There is a struggle here in Genesis, and it is a struggle against what? According to the text. And what's the problem?
It's people trying to be as God.
Yes, it's people trying to be as God, but how specifically are they trying to be like God?
By building a city in a town with its holy name.
So they're building a big building, and what else are they doing? What are the results of building that big building?
To make a name for themselves.
Yeah. See, they're not really trying to be like God, they're trying to make a name for themselves. What kind of a name do you think they're trying to make for themselves? These tower builders. It's an interesting story. This is a very primal story in the tradition. It is the culmination of the so-called primeval narrative of Genesis. That is, the cycle right in the initial narrative that kicks off the biblical narrative as a whole. You have creation, and you have fall, and then you have a number of cycles. You have the cycles of the first time the people got it wrong, and the flood, and the second time that the people got it wrong, which culminates not in a flood, but in a tower. And immediately after this story and the genealogy that follows it, the second great character of the biblical narrative is introduced, and that is Sarai and Abram. So this, usually Genesis 1 to 11 are considered the primeval narrative cycle, after which the kind of story of the people begins with these wandering shepherd types. This is no marginal story, this Babel story. It's very fundamental to the whole argument of the story of Genesis. That is, the first time, actually the three times that people get it wrong. The first time is in the garden. The second time is as a result of fratricide, Cain and Abel, and giants wandering the earth. Think for a minute what the significance to a traditional people of giants wandering the earth in Genesis 5 might be. And this is, the human project is so, in such a short time, becomes such a project of domination, from Cain and Abel to the giants roaming the earth, that there is a flood, as God says, this is out of control, we need to start over. And you know the story of Noah and the flood, and then there is the second time, which very quickly, again, gets it wrong and builds a tower. So the three symbols of the fall, of the alienation, whatever metaphor you want to use, in primal human history is alienation from garden, giants on the earth, tower reaching to heaven. What does the tower represent? First of all, you think there were real towers reaching to the heavens at the time these stories were written? Or is this kind of a fantastic story, or do you think this might be a meditation on some kind of urban architectural reality?
Well, they had tall towers.
Yeah, who had tall towers?
Well, in Babel, in that part of the world.
Yes, what part of the world was Babel? Babel is a play on words.
Babylon.
Babylon, that's right. This is a not so thinly veiled criticism of Imperial Babylon, with its ziggurats reaching to the heavens and its massive architectural projects and building projects, in which the biblical writer makes a play on words: Babylon, Babel, confusion. Oh, all these migrating Hebrews are having a good chuckle over this one, because they're having a go at the imperial city of Babylon. This is a city, no doubt, some of them have seen with their own eyes, but probably most of them have only heard about. I mean, these are stories that the Hebrews are telling to themselves. Hebrews who are kind of out in the bush, they're existing on the margins, they're telling these stories about how the world came to be. And as far as they are concerned, the archetype of evil is a big tower called Babel. It is what people build. Look carefully at the story for a minute. These stories we have in the Bible are really extraordinary. They're ancient stories, and yet they deal with this most amazing kind of symbols and archetypes. It starts out in 1032, that the nations spread across the earth. That's the plan. Spread it around. Spread it around. But what happens instead is there is this migration to a central place. And verse 3, they said to one another, This is a very primal narrative. It's who is they? Where is this coming from? It's fundamental, archetypal human narrative. They said to one another, these people who had concentrated on the plain of Shinar, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." Now, what story, if you're a Hebrew, does that remind you of?
Slavery in Egypt.
Slavery in Egypt, sure. Understand that these stories are all related to one another, and you're Hebrews living on the margins, and you're telling stories around the campfire or in your little open worship, and you know all of the stories, and as soon as you hear people sitting around making bricks, you immediately think, ugh, been there, done that. We know what that's all about. We know that all towers reaching to the heavens actually are produced by slaves who make bricks. So there is a social cost to tower building. So this is the start of this narrative, is the burning of bricks. Let us build ourselves a city with a tower, and a tower with its top in the heavens, so that we can make a name for ourselves, precisely in order to not do what?
Get scattered.
Precisely in order to resist the mandate to scatter, to spread around. This is a very fundamental issue here in the primeval narrative, is the kind of divine instruction, spread it around, and the human impulse, concentrate it, centralize it, build it up. The price being that you need a class of people who are brick makers. So God sees this and says, aha, one people, one language, and this is only the beginning. One people, one language, this is only the beginning. Nothing will be impossible for them. Now understand that the divine voice here is not thinking here of the arts and of all the wonderful creative things that people can do, because the primeval cycle of Genesis has not focused on that. It has focused on fratricide. It has focused on giants roaming the earth. It has focused on betrayal, the story of Noah and Noah's sons. In other words, the primeval narrative of Genesis is an attempt to narrate human alienation from creation, from each other as human beings, even from one's own kinship system. And so, the centralization, seems to be a project that doesn't have happy consequences, particularly for the brickmakers. And what is the vehicle of unity here? What is the cultural vehicle?
Speech.
Yes, it is monoculture. It is one language. And now, in the hegemonic sphere of Babylon, right, in the projection of Babylon's cultural influence, whose language do you think everybody had to speak? Probably it's the language of the Babylonian rulers. That's usually how it works, isn't it? When one people exercises hegemony and centralizes power in order to assert its control over a region, one of the primary mechanisms or vehicles for sustaining cultural, political hegemony is to teach those people our language. It is a superior language. It is a more elegant language. It is the language of empire. It is the language of commerce. It's only practical that everyone should learn our language. Ever seen that story on this continent? Interesting. Same story on the continent that I come from. And So in this primal story, there's the archetype of centralization, monoculture, building big imperial towers, all as symbols of a historical project of domination. And there is the divine impulse to break it down, to scatter it, to confuse it. Wink, wink, nod, nod. That's the Hebrew joke. Babylon, Babel, these people are very, very confused. Why would anybody want to make everybody else speak their language? Or I guess the other way to say that is, every time we've seen one people, one language, there are brickmakers at the bottom. And so the Lord scatters them again over the face of the earth. And deconstructs, if you will, use the modern term, the linguistic monoculture. Well, there's that little story there that is right at the beginning of this whole narrative. The first archetype of empire, even before Egypt, even before Assyria, even before Rome, is Babel. The greatest empire of the Bronze Age. And most people were busy praising the Babylonian project. It was so great, it was so massive. And here are these Hebrews telling jokes, very bitter kind of jokes about Babel and its project. And then we turn to Acts. Let us just imagine that the book of Acts is written at the heart of a later imperial project. Which imperial project was that? And do you think the Romans were trying to administer their hegemony through a master language? Sure they were. It wasn't Roman, it was Greek. Because the Romans had inherited this imperial sphere from the Greeks. And that is why we have a New Testament written in Greek. That is why so much of the archaeological script that we can uncover from this period is in Greek, because this is the imperial language throughout the entire Mediterranean. Why else would people in Palestine be speaking Greek? Doesn't make sense. It's not the local idiom. It's the language of the empire. And here in this new primal narrative, right, what is the book of Acts except another creation story? The world beginning again. The Holy Spirit comes down, and the very first thing that happens is the tongues are divided. That's pretty interesting. In case we didn't get the allusion to the Babel story, we're told again in Acts 2 verse 4, they were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages. This is the very first thing that happens at Pentecost. Before anything else, linguistic diversity is restored. What a concept! And in case we didn't get that illusion, then we are told again, amazed and astonished. Everybody here is Galilean, and yet we hear the Parthian and Medes and Elamites and Mesopotamians. That's the Babel story again, Mesopotamia. Judeans, Cappadocians, Pontus, Asians, papa. It's a long list. It's a rescattering. It's a rediversification. Why? Or, in the question of verse 11, verse 12, all were amazed and perplexed. That's good gospel language when you see something you don't understand. All were amazed and perplexed, saying, what does this mean? course, years of good theological preaching that put all texts at the service of a certain theological imperialism say, oh, well, this linguistic diversity is simply a means so that we can preach the gospel to the whole world. What if Pentecost is an attempt to restore the order of Babel? What if God really wants human beings living in diversity? What if that is so fundamental that it is told at the beginning of the story and that it is reiterated at the beginning of the new story? That is the story of the church. What if it is that fundamental? That primal? I don't know. But here are these stories where we are invited to reflect on them and to ask what they mean. Well, what would be the advantage, biblically speaking, to linguistic diversity? Well, let me frame it differently. What does linguistic diversity stand against in the biblical narrative of Babel and Pentecost? Stands against monoculture, and monoculture stands for empire. And there is a certain correlation in human history between cultural uniformity, political conformity, economic domination. There really is. In fact, if there's any pattern that holds true through human history, it is that one. Wherever power is centralized, wherever cultural hegemony is practiced, there are brickmakers suffering at the bottom, not to mention all the tribes and nations who are culturally dispossessed as a result of the fire. And the theological reading of that is not so much wrong as it is passing over the most important point. It is important that the good news be preached, but it is very important that it is preached in all the tribal tongues. That there is a certain restoration happening here. That it is not preached in the imperial tongue, but that it is that tongue has been divided. That is the Pentecostal moment. So that all the debates about speaking in tongues in churches, that is, tongues nobody can understand because it's some kind of divine spiritual spectacle, I don't know about all of that. That's all very well and good. However that works. But what the Pentecostal moment is all about is about the reiteration, the re-establishment, it seems to me, of the Babel critique. And that is the centralization of power is the problem. That's why Israel didn't have a king, Exodus Israel. They had a tribal confederacy to allow that kind of diversity, that kind of decentralization structured right into their very nature as free Exodus Israel. You leave Egypt, because to be in Egypt is to be a brickmaker. You leave Egypt and you establish a tribal confederacy. 12 different tribes, that's a lot. It's a lot of different units to confederate. It's a confederacy, that's important too. There's a conversation among the 12 tribes. But there is no single ruler. That's a hedge against Babel. See, Babel is Egypt, is Assyria, is Rome. That's the biblical map, Paul. Babel equals Rome. That's why in the book of Revelation, the name for Rome is Babylon. And it's an equation because all of them are centralized, militarized, culturally hegemonic empires. And to journey out of that as an Exodus people is to be in a tribal confederacy. So when Jesus calls disciples, how many does he call? He goes up on a mountain and names 12 disciples. Wink, wink, nod, nod. Remember that story? That is the re-tribalization of the people. The people who are now just another client kingdom under the imperial sphere. It is a symbolic re-tribalization saying we've got to get back to the scattering, because the scattering is a hedge against the primal impulse to dominate, which is the characteristic of human fallenness. The primal urge to dominate, to murder, Cain and Abel, to dominate, Babel, Murder Incorporated. And as a hedge against that, my people will be a tribalistic people, affirming decentralized decision-making and so on. And as we know in the biblical story, Israel can't hang with that. They want to be like the other nations. So they get themselves a king, they become a little empire. That's the whole project of David and Solomon. And the rest of biblical history in the Hebrew Bible unfolds with prophets constantly railing against the kings. An extraordinary biblical history. There is no history in antiquity in which the literary remains, the court writings, as it were, are actually critical of the king. All other remaining literature, that is surviving literature of antiquity, since most of the literate were in the court anyway, are all praising the king. All telling the kings and the royal families what great people they are and what wonderfully beneficent people they are. And only in the Hebrew writings do we find this relentless railing by prophets on kings. As Jacques Ellul has pointed out in his book on anarchism, the refrain of the biblical histories, that is Kings and Chronicles, the refrain is, and so was king and did evil in the sight of the Lord. So much for the court propaganda. And if you're a weak king, then you're a good king, and if you're a strong king, then you're a bad king. Because there is this remnant understanding in the biblical history that strong, centralized politics are the problem. And what we have to do is keep breaking it down. Which is why exile is not all that bad from the point of view of the prophets. It's a disappointment, it's very painful, but it's not all that bad. Live with it, says Jeremiah. Deal with it! And when they're involved in the return and the restoration, once again, there is the temptation to construct this centralized edifice of power and the kind of primal re-articulation of Genesis 11 in the New Testament, in the Gospel story, is Mark 13. Let's look at it just for a sec. One of my favorite texts. Mark 13. What the heck? That's Mark 12, 41 through 13, 2. Somebody want to stand up and read Mark 12, 41 through 13, 2? Anybody? Thank you.
As Jesus sat near the temple treasury, he watched the people as they dropped in their money. Is that the right one?
Yeah, that sure is.
Many rich men dropped in a lot of money. Then a poor widow came along and dropped in 2 little copper coins, worth about a penny. He called his disciples together and said to them, I tell you that this poor widow put more in the offering box than all the others. For the others put in what they had to spare of their riches. But she, poor as she is, put in all she had. She gave all she had to live on. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said, Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and buildings. Jesus answered, You see these great buildings? Not a single stone here will be left in its place. Every one of them will be thrown out.
Oh, you knew we'd get to Mark eventually, didn't you? Well, all right, this is the quaint story of the devout piety of a poor widow, right? In which she is commended for her great sacrifice to church, and that's usually preached on Stewardship Sunday. Problem is, this is not a commendation. What is there commending about it? It couldn't be less laudatory. What is the conflict that the text speaks about? What is the contrast? It's between who and who?
Rich and poor.
Between the rich who give out of their surplus and the poor who give everything. Stated twice in verse 44. She, out of her poverty, put in everything she had. Always look for the rhetorical repetitions in biblical narrative because they're making a case. This woman, in other words, has been made what? She was poor to begin with when she went into the temple. She's not just poor now.
Right.
She's busted. She's destitute. You think she went in willingly? Does it say anything about her going in willingly? Why did people go in to pay to the temple treasury? See, folks, this isn't an offering played in church. Whatever the Good News Bible translation says, this is not an offering played in church. This is tax time. You go in and you put in, because if you don't, they will put you in the slammer. And the rich have no problem with that because they can afford it, and poor people are made destitute by that system. And look at the irony. Jesus, this is the very last object lesson that he gives in the temple. By the way, in the very previous story, if you look in verses 39 and 40 of chapter 12 in Mark, Jesus is launching into the scribal elite. Why? Because of the way they devour the houses of widows. So you've got this widow class being completely chewed up and spit out by scribal elite and temple economy. Jesus points this out, stalks right out of the temple for the last time in Mark, goes down and he sits opposite the temple in 13:3, and the disciples, being good kind of cathedral Christians, are saying, "Man, check out that tower! All right? Nice bricks!" It is easy to be awed by the edifice of power and the architecture of power. It happens to all of us all the time, whether it's big churches, big office buildings, big parliament buildings, big towers, big rocketry, whatever kind of phallic symbol there is. It's big and it must be important. Right? And one of your own, I think, called that missile envy or something like that, didn't you? And Jesus says, "You see those bricks?" He says, "Yeah. Remember those bricks?" He says, "Brick by bloody brick, it's coming down." He's saying that about the national symbol of his people. He's saying that about Parliament House in his own cultural and political context, friends. Right. In other words, it is easy to be awed by centralized monoculture and all of its legitimations. And this is kind of the articulation of that anti-Babel bias that runs from beginning to end in biblical history. The bias is absolutely clear. Babel is the problem. First story. Rome is Babylon. and it will burn. Last story. And everything in between. And Pentecost, the moment of renewal, is all about redistributing the tongues. And what is that a metaphor for, according to this story of Bacon? Why are people confused into tribal tongues? Is that a symbol of the breaking down of?
Power.
Of power.
That's exactly right.
Language is power. So if there is a narrative invitation to reflect on what we today call multiculturalism, which I think is better understood as the cultural redistribution of power, I think is a more accurate phrase. That is, we only speak of multiculturalism because we're trying to struggle against cultural imperialism, right? And that's where this whole contemporary conversation comes from. It is all about how cultural imperialism is one of the main vehicles for political, economic, and social domination. And therefore we speak of multiculturalism because we're interested in the redistribution of power and the creation of greater equality. And lo and behold, the Bible is right there with us. Which is a little dicey because, of course, the Bible has been used as one of these swords of cultural imperialism. Because it wasn't being read well. It was being read with imperial eyes, not with re-tribalized eyes. But the biblical motif is re-tribalize, re-tribalize, re-tribalize. That is, break it down, scatter it out, localize it, self-determine it, bust the empire. Simply because it's a better way to be human. It's a hedge against edifices and architectures and monocultures of domination. Well, I just want to throw that out there because I think we might not be perhaps completely aware that the Bible is on our side in the struggle for multiculturalism as much as it is. I think perhaps we assume that because the Bible has been used as a tool of cultural domination, that must be what it says. It doesn't say that. It has been used that way. And so I do believe that the Bible can become an ally in the struggle for re-tribalization. And what I'd like to devote the rest of our time together is just to have a discussion about what does that look like today. I know it's a big issue here in Australia, certainly a big issue in my country. What does it mean to struggle for multicultural justice, for the redistribution of cultural power?
Does it mean then, interesting when you're talking about the diversification, that the unity really is that God is the symbol of that. And that's one thing that I've reflected on. The other thing, if you have all your little tribal groups, you still have the problem of them squabbling among themselves.
Sure.
So you've got that element as well. What would you say about those two things?
Yeah, well, sure. Well, maybe what we can do, I think what might be useful to do is to try to identify some questions and some issues that we'd like to wrestle with. Then we'll take a tea break, and we'll come back and wrestle with it in a conversation. So certainly, one of the issues around the multicultural question is, if I may rephrase that slightly into the modern way, what about Balkanism? Balkanism. What about tribal squabbling? And it is a big problem, and it is also being sold by the metropolises as the problem, with a not-so-hidden interest being it's much safer in empire than it is out in the Balkanist peripheries. Balkanism is the new demon. Communism used to be, now it's Balkanism. So it is a real issue, and we need to look at it. We also need to understand how it's being used in the debate. Okay, that's one issue. Religious pluralism, yeah. All right. Yeah, is it possible for a church with such an imperial history to reimagine itself in a pluralist world? That's a big issue theologically facing the Christian tradition. All right? Other kinds of issues, as general or specific as you want in terms of the context here.
What about how the church positions itself on issues? I mean, the one that comes to my mind is female circumcision. Genital mutilation.
In Africa.
Yeah. So in our society, I mean, how does the Christian tradition relate to certain cultural expressions that we might perceive as being fundamentally unjust? So how do you establish just normatives?
Yep. Okay. So what are the parameters for a Christian critique of culture?
That's right.
It's a really good question. I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming. It's great. This is a busy woman. Somebody else got a hand up over
The balancing of stirring indigenous cultures and also communicating the gospel.
Say more about that.
Well, I suppose just the importance of seeing indigenous cultures as being just in themselves and promoting their own development. But then there's the question of how do we communicate with that? How do we incarnate?
All right, so maybe we could call that, if you agree with this, the dialectic between self-determination and evangelism. Would that generally cover, in other words, how do we hold both of those values?
Yeah.
Self-determination and evangelism. Specifically in the Australian context around the question of native title and Aboriginal cultural integrity.
If we can't walk out on, like the children of Israel walked out on the monoculture, if you've got to coexist in the monoculture, how can we ensure that the minority groups have political power? I mean, they still need access in this country to learn English.
Right.
And in our church we were doing that, we were providing English lessons. But now the government's taken that over, and I don't know how the funding's going for that. It could be in jeopardy, but I think we're learning English.
So the struggle for cultural diversity within kind of dominant cultures.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a big question.
So that everyone has the opportunity to participate politically.
Big question. Big question. Good one. Yes.
I find the electronic highway scary. I can't quite formulate a question around it, but that sort of interconnecting of great nations and to this invisible highway.
Right. How do we keep from becoming road pizzas on the Infobahn? What about the information highway as a advanced technology of monoculture? Big one. Maybe one or two more, and then we'll take our obligatory cultural ritual tea. And so,
How do we deconstruct that one?
all right. So we'll call that the title. We deconstruct
Deconstruct or a little bit?
Babylon. All right. All right, well that's plenty for a very good discussion, I think. Let me just say that all of these questions are questions we're facing, obviously, in the U.S. as well. What we've done here for folks who just came is we've identified some basic questions that are germane to the struggle for multiculturalism, for lack of a better word, or how do we deconstruct Babylon, in Peter's elegant phrase. As a context for discussing these, let me offer a model that an American theologian has offered, which at least I find to be useful. It's what he calls the trialectic of doing theology and being church in a context of cultural pluralism. There's dialectic and then there's trialectic. It's trying to hold three things together at once, even though they may seem to be at odds with each other. One is what he calls the need to acknowledge tradition. That is, everyone who is going to be in a culturally pluralistic setting must know what their culture is. Big issue for white folks. We cannot be a part of a multicultural deal if we do not know what we bring to the table. So we must acknowledge traditions, we must have our own roots, and for many of us this will include our religious traditions and roots. At the same time, we celebrate plurality, acknowledging that it is a fact, perhaps even out of our tradition, affirming that it is a good thing, a better thing than monoculture. And a lot of our own kind of political and social and cultural practice will come out of a commitment to pluralism. But that's going to be a huge project for Christianity, because Christianity sold out roughly 15 centuries ago to to an anti-pluralistic theology. Not the original theology. New Testament theology assumes pluralism, but from Constantine on, most Christian social projects have been anti-pluralistic. So that's the second part of the trialectic, and then the third part of the trialectic is the struggle to resist domination wherever and whenever it happens. This is going to be real important in terms of the cultural critique, because it affirms that all cultural formations have practices of domination as well as liberation, not just Christendom. Right? So, acknowledging who we are, celebrating the others rather than condemning them, and resisting domination, which means we will probably be forming working alliances with other people in the context of domination. Anyway, I find it a useful model. It may or may not be useful to you, but it seems to begin to address some of these questions here. What about Balkanism? Do some people want to reflect a little bit about the problem of tribal squabbling? Talk about that a little bit.
Could I just say, I find what you say, as an Irishman, I find what you say very hopeful, because over the last few hundred years, first of all, there was an attempt to make Irish culture British. Right. Now there's an attempt to make Protestant culture nationalist. And this says both of these are valid and somehow have to be held together in a constructive pluralist relationship. And that, I think, is very hopeful.
The mention of Ireland, I think, is useful, because the way in which Ireland is often reported in dominant media, the image most people have, particularly of Northern Ireland, in their minds, is, well, geez, I mean, different tribal peoples can't live together. We really need the British Empire to keep the peace. Right? That's the mythic discourse of the empire. That, you know, if we withdraw the imperial umbrella, withdraw the imperial police, look what happens in the former Yugoslavia, look what happens in Northern Ireland, and so on. Is that true?
What about in Russia? Now the central government is not there, you've got all the breakup, and the groups warring one against the other.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the unifying kind of principle in diversity? even when there are different concepts of God, it's troubled me before, it assumes there's an obedience and a unified understanding of God, so to enable all these diverse groups to stay in some kind of harmony.
Okay, so we're cooking up the hard cases. We've got the Balkans, we've got Northern Ireland, now we've got Russia. What do you want to add to the pot before we all despair and go home?
Well, Nigeria is a nation which is destroying itself inwardly.
Okay.
10th biggest, about 11th biggest nation in the world.
Certainly, there's any number of examples from Africa that we could draw on in terms of tribal conflicts.
Papua New Guinea is an interesting one in that in independence in 1975, it sort of was landed on its feet, but then it slowly started to pick up itself, being separated.
So PNG, Nigeria, former Soviet Union, Northern Ireland, former Yugoslavia. What are all these? Or what were all these when they were?
Colonies.
Colonies.
Well, some of them were colonies. Some of them were colonizing. But what were they all? What would we call them in the modern parlance? We would call them, in the curious phrase of modernity, nation states. Curious parlance because what it really articulates is the fact that in a given state, capital S, you often have many nations. And the project of the state has been to nationalize the consciousness of, in fact, different nations. Right? The Greek word for nations is ethnos, from which we get our word ethnic, that is, peoples. And the struggle of any state anywhere in the world, any state anywhere in the world, is to try to get the allegiance of diverse peoples within its hegemony. Is it not? Can you think of a case where that's not? Even in the most ethnically thank you. Ethnically singular. I think of a place like Norway. I've lived there, so I have some knowledge of Norway. We usually think of a place like Norway, kind of everybody's Norwegian, or at least up until recently when there's been a lot of immigration from Europe. Even a place like Norway, you've got the Sami people, who are the Laplanders, the indigenous people of the north, who have been completely marginalized by the Norwegian state project. And you've got at least 2 different languages within Norway. Did you know that? There's New Norwegian, which is in fact Old Norwegian. Nynorsk, which was the dialect spoken in the western valleys. In fact, there were many, many different dialects, and it would be, say, what as different as Portuguese is to Spanish, different enough that it's different. And up until about 30 years ago, those who spoke Nynorsk, that is Old Norsk, were marginalized until they finally agitated and struggled and got it recognized as an official language. So there are actually 2 official languages in Norway. Even Norway is about different peoples who are under the rubric of a state. And so if all the examples we've given are states who are trying to organize and indeed domesticate nations within them, what clue might that give us to why there is turmoil? Take the Soviet Union. Why would there be fragmentation? Did it not exist while the Soviet Union was there? Was in power? Was there no dissent under Tito in Yugoslavia?
Suppressed.
It was suppressed dissent. What happens when you suppress dissent?
It goes underground. Still weird.
It goes underground until it busts open. So why are we surprised that there would be ethnic strife in Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union or Nigeria or South Africa? If, that is, the natural lay of the land in terms of what we might call social or political ecology, a natural lay of the human landscape is diversity. There are different peoples, different groups, different tribes, different tongues, no matter where you look. And it is only when there's been a concerted project by a state to make a national consciousness, that is, a national consciousness which marginalizes or perhaps erases altogether the minority peoples within it, that you have the modern concept of the nation state. But see, the myth of the nation state is that everybody's happily nationalistic. That is, loyal to the state. But where is that really true? Where in the world is there a happy state? It's worth thinking about, because we, all through the 19th and 20th centuries, we have been observing and participating in this progress of making nation states.
I just did Nauru with its 4,000 people, and highest world income of any people in the world. Fly over Australia for a holiday a couple of times a year and fly back again.
Right, Nauru. Ever been to Nauru? I have. What a place. Pacific Islands are good examples. I mean, Vanuatu has 100,000 people and 26 languages. New Caledonia, same thing. Slightly larger population. Literally hundreds of languages. Let's take indigenous people. Indigenous people, when confronted by Western civilizations, what was the rub? What was the rub in treaty making? Even though I guess there wasn't too much of that happened here, was there?
They're unequal partners
Yeah, and how are they unequal?
in terms of power.
In terms of what kinds of power?
Control of land.
Control of land, military technology, economic power, but very much also the political conceptualization of a monocultural imperial notion that we must create one state versus people who are fundamentally tribal, who make alliances and who are back and forth in kind of federation with each other, but who have literally no concept of the state as the overall apparatus to which all people are loyal. I mean, have you ever noticed that among indigenous people, is there's no concept of the state? There's not. It doesn't exist. Different way of being human.
It doesn't mean the state's fundamentally evil, though. When you think, say, in China, you had so much war between different little groups that people lived in terror of their lives, and some kind of central administration gives the opportunity for a more peaceful kind of life and for education and other benefits. So I think it's a very complicated situation.
It is indeed complicated. Let none of us think that it's not complicated. But I would like to challenge what I think is a deeply ingrained assumption in us. And that assumption is centralization of power is better. I think it's very deep in all of us because we've been socialized into it and because we have been told that that is completely identified with civilization, with progress, with democracy. And yet, let us think, sure, tribal warfare, intertribal conflict. What do we have so far? Simply that writ large, conflict and war between nation states. So nation states haven't solved it, they simply have enlarged the scope of intertribal warfare. What about the concept of a kind of a truce-making, mutual policing, mutual accountability concept between entities, such as on the international level, such as The United Nations. What is the United Nations except a tribal confederacy? That is, different tribes, however the tribes are nation states, getting together around a table to try to talk through differences, to try to resolve conflict, and to try to help police conflicts. At least in the high concept of the UN, that's what it is. Well, where does that concept come from? Tribal confederacy.
It's sort of a cooperation, isn't it?
Yes, it's a cooperative model. It is not a state model. It is not a federalist model.
It's the federalist model for Australia is a cooperative one, where each state agrees to certain rules, even though they might be unhappy about certain aspects of it.
If you limit your federal power, if you limit federal power, then a federalist model can indeed be very close to a kind of a tribal confederacy. But if federal power gets too great, you no longer really have a confederation. What you have is a unitary state. That's the situation in my country. The feds hold all the power. And I understand that there's less federal power here. And insofar as that is the case, that's a step in the right direction. But of course, that hasn't yet resolved the question within the nation-state concept, in which you've got the states who are kind of tiny little federalist powers.
How do we link this back to our understanding of God? This could be like a politics and democracy and general humanist principles, if you like. How do we push it back to the original point that God has chosen diversity for the people? It probably depends on their obedience to that God, and that's where there's a lot of problems.
That's what's interesting about the biblical story, is God wants diversity. There's nothing about contingent diversity, that is, diversity will work only if. It is, God wants diversity. God mandates diversity. The narrative legitimizes diversity and delegitimizes centralized power. That is, diversity is a better, what we might call a better natural theology, a better natural ecology. It is simply a better way to be human. Now, within that, the question of identification with God, the theological questions may be asked, but that is not how we have asked them. We have asked them from the point of view and with the power of empire, of monocultural civilizations. We have identified those two. In other words, here are the Jews. They've got this high God concept, and they're a little 2-bit anti-game in the corner of the world. How do you figure? How do you figure that you can have this high God concept, and all you are a little tribe of people over here in the corner of nowhere? It's kind of interesting. And we think somehow that can't work. But that's all the Bible has. It has Jews as a minority people, and it has Christians as a minority people. It is never assumed that Christians will control the game in the Bible. Can't be imagined. Can't be imagined. So one of our great theological dilemmas today is to try to reimagine ourselves into a biblical worldview where Christians are not in control of the board.
Chair, I wonder if you... some, of course, would argue that a traditional Christian theology is intrinsically hierarchical, and therefore God, in God's self, actually is a symbol of centralised power. I wonder if you could unpack it a little bit, maybe talking about diversity within the nature of God, the Trinity. Because that's a sticking point, you see, for many people.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. And I think people who argue, as many do today, that monotheism is inherently dominating, are probably making more sociological observations than theological ones. That is to say, that historically monotheistic civilizations over the last 2,000 years, well, last 1,500 years, have been dominating. Therefore, it must be that a monotheistic notion of God is dominating. But then, see, that then has to encounter the pre-Constantinian version of monotheism, which is not identified with monoculture. That's the reason I wanted to do Bible study at the beginning, is to try to remind us that this, quote, monotheism is completely disidentified with monoculture in the biblical story. That's the first thing. Second thing is, it seems to me, well, obviously you've pointed it out, and it's an important insight in Christian theology, that there is a plurality of God. That's the Trinitarian notion, and I think you've said that. It's there in the tradition, it's useful to work on. It also predates the Christian tradition. There is a notion of the plurality of God among the Elohim and the Hebrew. But the third thing, I think, and I personally think the most important aspect of our theological tradition, as long as we understand our theological tradition predates Constantine. As a matter of fact, I think it ended at Constantine. I mean, our tradition ended at Constantine and became a Constantinian tradition after that, is that the God who is identified as God, the one and only God in the biblical tradition, is the God who cannot be named. Exodus 3. Who shall I say sent me, says Moses. I am who I am. Don't ever try to name me. That is what some theologians try to call a non-identified God. Not non-identifiable, but non-identified. That means the God who will not and cannot be identified with our cultural, social, political project. And that is the God who names God's self, which in the biblical tradition is expressly an anti-dominating stipulation. That is, don't name me. And as long as human beings can't name God, then human beings cannot put God at the service of their historical projects. Well, of course they can do that, and do that, but that's not the biblical God. And the biblical God works against that. So wherever and whenever God's name is put at the service of a dominating historical project, the biblical God is listening to the cry of the brickmakers and is aligned against that. Even if those are Hebrew kings. Even if those are Christian kings. Or maybe even especially if those are Hebrew or Christian kings. God is aligned with the little people against that. And I think that's very important for us to recover in our theological discourse. That, monotheism isn't a philosophical concept for us. It is the notion that the true God cannot be named. And all the other gods that are being put at the historical pleasure of rulers of this or that entity are simply not God. They are idols, they are other gods, they are, as the Exodus narrative puts it, you follow other gods back to Egypt. You follow other gods back to Egypt. There's only one God headed out of Egypt. That's the unnameable God. All the nameable gods are headed back into Egypt. Would be the way Exodus would put it. So I think those things, trying to really disidentify the Yahweh, the I am who I am God, which is Jesus God, and is the Christian God, to try to sever that God's identity with all the monocultural projects that we've had in history. Not because we're trying to not be accountable for all of that. I think we have to be accountable for all of that. Let me say that very clearly. We must be accountable for the crimes of Christendom in some meaningful sense. But God is not identified and never has been. So if we want to be about the biblical God, we have to make that alignment. And then I think the Trinitarian concept as well. These are at least some resources we have in our tradition that are not about top-down monotheism. Not at all.
But doesn't Catherine Acuna in her book God for Us break that open? In that the Cappadocian Fathers and the Syrian tradition spoke about you have that immanent God that is God, the interworkings of God out there in the monotheistic form. But there is this Trinitarian philosophy of God as relationship, this the dance, the communion that happens between creation, creator, and the forces of next force of love.
I think this is a lot of the problems are to do with our images of God as being, and that's what we've been taught, the image of God as being one God, made out of three parts, but one God who's all powerful and who is like a king, and then we set up our structures and stuff in the image of that type of a God. But I had a fantastic insight last year when we started reading about the Trinity as being three beings making up this one God. And then if we are to be in the image of God, therefore we are many in the image of God as community. And understanding the notion of God not being one all-powerful being, but God being community in relationship. And for us to seek the image of God is to seek relationship. That relates a lot, I think, to a lot of what you're saying about the idea of the tribes being in relationship and being okay for individual groups to be different from one another, as long as they seek to be in some sort of relationship. And that's seeking to be in the image of God.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that in the biblical narrative, you have a plurality of communities who are covenanted. There's your confederacy. Human history ever since has been trying to figure out how do you maintain diversity, but a covenanted diversity. That is, a place for people to be different, have different identities, and yet to be in covenant together to do their business, whatever they have to do. Here we are in the waning years of the 20th century, and we're still trying to figure out how to do that. We do have resources in our tradition that do address this question. We might want to talk about this self-determination and evangelism question. I think it's a big one. Is it possible, as Christian people, to preach good news and to affirm the self-determination of people, even people who want to disidentify themselves with the good news? Is that possible?
I think we need to reconcile some of what's happened in the past. Like a lot of what you were talking about, grouping people and naming people, I associate a lot with colonisation, and a tool of colonisation was Christianity, and categorising people, or also like my first image I was thinking when you said, don't identify me as such and such, or name me as such and such. I think back to in New Zealand, Aotearoa, when the Pākehā first came to Aotearoa, and the Maori people said, we're many people, we're of many tribes, and yet the Europeans wanted to say, well, we're going to call you Maori, you're going to be one people, you should be one, you are one people, and kind of part of the having to combat colonisation was actually to have to become one people, and then to have your own king and queen. I mean, there's still a Maori queen, but that was kind of part of a survival tactic. But actually to say, well, don't name us as what you think we are. We know where we come from. Many people really.
And that story was repeated all over the world. Of conquering peoples, not all of whom were Christian, but many of whom were. Encountering tribal people who had a natural resistance to that. And of course, the great tragedy was that the conquest was so often done in the name or with the complicity of the Christian gospel. We have to say that. It is absolute denial to say anything else. And yet, does that mean that we abandon the good news, abandon Christian mission, abandon evangelism?
The evangelism, we think of it as something aggressive, but it actually is the good news. And it is linked. I mean, Jesus talks about the good news of the kingdom, and then you've got to spell out what the kingdom is. But also, it is inextricably linked with Jesus. And I mean, if it's good news for us, it's good news for everybody else. I mean, whether they choose to accept it or not, I think we have to share it somehow and to practice it. How do you combine that with?
Well, of course, maybe we assume a little too much when we say it's good news for us. Maybe it's not so good news for us as people of privilege. Maybe it's very hard news for us. Maybe it's good news to the poor. If it's good news for the poor, see, it's good news to offer a people and a covenant and a story that resists domination. That's good news all over the world. That is, to those who are on the business end of domination. And so it might be possible to acknowledge a tradition that in and of itself is on the side of those who are resisting domination in any cultural framework. But this has been the missing ingredient in Christian history, is the fundamental commitment to acknowledge diversity. In the Americas, when the missionaries came, depending on what circumstances they came under, time and time again there is evidence that indigenous peoples were very interested in hearing this story. But at the moment that it was identified with the project of European land expropriation, the European musket, European selfishness, people lost interest. Well, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't?
But then again, there are places like in Tonga or Samoa where there's a real strong Christian community and people, it's become part of your tradition is to go to church, and everybody has, and Sundays often they don't do anything. But I also see that linked into self-determination as actually owning and transforming a tradition that's been shared or passed on, and actually transforming it, making it your own. But, yeah.
I mean, look, the missionary project, which we trivialize if we think it was universally benign, and we also trivialize if we think it was universally horrific, because it was not either. It was unfortunately linked historically and complicit historically with a project of conquest and domination. But there was a great deal of diversity in the missionary enterprise, including, again, I think of indigenous peoples in the Americas, the Nez Perce, who received the gospel and immediately became missionaries to other native groups far distinct and apart from white civilization. So that many indigenous tribes in the Northwest had heard the gospel long before the European ever got there. There are stories like that. The gospel tradition itself, in its missionary language, Mark 6, says, go out where you get received, it's great, stay a while. Right? When any house welcomes you, stay a while. That is, be in that place. Don't conquer that place. Don't claim that place for the king. Be in that place. And where places are not hospitable, move the hell on. That's what Mark 6 teaches. And in the business of it, don't take much with you. You see, the baggage is one of the big problems of Christian evangelism. We take our civilization with us, and we take our security devices with us, backed by the army. But Mark 6 is very clear. When you go, take just enough to get you where you're going. What does that mean? When you get to where you're going and you don't have anything, what are you going to be dependent on? You're going to be dependent on the hospitality of the people. A missionary who is dependent on hospitality cannot be a dominating missionary for very long. So all I'm saying is that there are lots of clues in our own tradition, right there, that we should have seen, but for obvious historical reasons have been lost to us. But we can claim the tradition. It is friendly to what we're talking about here. And it is, in fact, very unfriendly towards the dominating traditions. I would say it is at enmity with them.
I tend to think that this whole issue of evangelism, that instead of focusing evangelism on other than Christian people, we need to really evangelize the church again. And if we focus on getting our own act together and really understanding what it means to follow Jesus, and the good news may not be good news to us, that if we actually start practicing community and, all these, the common, start practicing the Jubilee, redistributing power and possession, that perhaps people will be attracted to the good news, which is our actions, our community, not the fact that we have to go out and convince people of it. And I think that when you're in a multicultural society, it's much better for people to be able to see what they have in common with us instead of us telling them what they have in common with us. And it's much more of a, practicing evangelism in our lives. But I really think the church is, the first step, it's kind of a bit too late for evangelism in the world. The first step is for us to evangelize the church, get back to the root of what it's all about.
And of course, that is also the biblical path. Prophets go to the people, Jesus goes to the synagogue, Paul goes to the synagogue. Always first. You go to the people of the story to see if they're reading the story well and living the story. If so, then we have a story to tell. If we aren't living the story, we have no story to tell, no matter how many muskets we've got. All we've got is bad news masquerading in the guise of good news. So I agree. I think that's a biblical pattern. It is really very much there in our tradition, friends. And I know it is very easy to despair that because these texts have been put at the service of death, therefore we should abandon these texts.
We've done
It
that
is
to our
not so
children.
easy.
Yeah, we've done that to our children in Western culture. Our graffiti artist movement stood on trains and said, how dare you segregate, how dare you say your own is. So we sent the police and killed them off. Instead of listening to their voices, instead of asking, what are you trying to tell us? And there's many, many teenagers, hundreds, that refuse to come through these doors for that very reason.
How can Christian people struggle on the side of cultural diversity in the dominant culture? It's 4:30, maybe we'll go for 10 more minutes? Since we started a little bit late, is that all right? 10 more minutes, all right. How can we ally ourselves with movements for cultural justice within the reality of the dominant culture? Let's not get too rosy-eyed or dewy-eyed is the word I'm looking for about multiculturalism. One of the big problems in the U.S. today is that multiculturalist discourse has been expropriated by the managerial sector, and there's a lot of people making big bucks as multicultural consultants in the workplace, and it's really about managing diversity. That's what that's all about. That is what I would call top-down diversity work, as opposed to multiculturalism from below, which is the diversity just kind of constantly resisting the attempts to enforce conformity. So how can we become allies in movements for cultural diversity? One issue was raised about, shouldn't we really be helping cultural ethnic minorities learn English so that they can compete and that they can survive? Now that is a role that many churches have seen. It's a kind of a role that churches have found easier to fulfill. And there's certainly an argument to be made for that in terms of empowerment. To empower a cultural minority to survive, giving people tools that they can survive with. But how can that become problematic?
Well, if it leads to like a denial of their culture, or like an abandonment or something, like by implication sort of thing, like learn English and do this way and do this sort of
Right. So why couldn't, say, churches make a commitment to teaching English as a second language that also made an equal commitment to the survival of the native language? Wouldn't that be a little bit more equalizing?
Or a commitment to learning their language as well, so you've got equal groups of people working together, and not one community dominating the other. But because sometimes I think it would be better to learn their language so we can translate for them and communicate, but not to take over their language. They keep their language. We have to deal, being the dominating people, we have to deal with learning the language, not them.
Not practical people will say. Who would bother to do it? Why would people in the dominant culture bother to do that? That then again raises the question of what is the church as a people?
I found what Carol just said difficult to think of as in terms of Australia, because there's so many people from all over the world here. It's blown me away since I lived here how multi-ethnic it is. But in New Zealand, I feel like there's been a strong movement for the last while and amongst the church to be bicultural and to use Māori language within translated by the text and everything. And so there's a move like to speak the language of the people who are from the land. And you know, we are the guests and speak their language. But in this context, I mean, because there's so many Aboriginal languages, but I just think it's also a part of just actually familiarised with culture and with what are the issues of people who are from this land. You know? And also, I find it difficult in talking about hearing words such as what do we need to do to help other people. I don't think it's an issue of helping other people, but actually not standing in the way of, and also saying, well, how can they help me to get out of my my own Eurocentrism, you know?
Of course, if we are monolinguistic by default, then we are in the way. I think it's part of the point Carol's making. We are in the way because we are not very much use. It's interesting, you know, most Europeans speak 2, 3, 4 languages. Most Americans just go ballistic at the idea of bilingualism. It's a socialization. It is possible for people to know many languages. I was at a theological seminary in New Caledonia where every pastor who was trained there not only learns the colonial languages of French and English for the studies, which is unfortunate, but this is what they do, but also has their own tribal tongue and learns at least 2 others for the pastoral ministry. 5 languages minimum. That's without even getting into the biblical languages. And these are supposedly relatively unsophisticated, poor, marginalized people. I don't think so. It is, what is, you know, we have to ask ourselves how we can imagine human life. And actually our imagination has been severely stunted by monoculture about what is possible.
But there are areas in the world where naturally people learn 3 or 4 languages because in their day-to-day life, well, you know, over the period of a month, they would actually be moving around, and that's true of Europe, because you move around and use the language, it develops people's ability to facilitate learning 3 or 4 languages. And I mean, there are many, as we know, many Europeans speak any number of languages, just as the same as you'll find, I've got a couple of ANC friends who speak 3 or 4, 5 different languages. And again, because in the course of their life they've moved around, they're using these languages all the time. But I think up until recent times in this country, that hasn't made everybody learn French, and you had no one to talk to unless you went overseas. And there's certainly not an encouragement to learning languages and becoming, be able to facilitate it and communicate it if you're not talking to people in those other tongues regularly. When you go to a classroom, say in the fringe suburbs of Melbourne, I mean, for many classroom teachers, you know, the problem is not learning, is how to keep the crow-apps from the serves in the classroom for the whole day, and suggest, you know, learning one language when you might have within many classrooms on the fringes of Melbourne anything up to 6 or 7 different languages in your classroom. I mean, by the time you've learnt one of them, in many cases those students will have moved on, because in Melbourne you've had this pattern. You had Turks, the Turks came into certain schools, they stayed for say 5 years and then they moved on to a different area of Melbourne. And there are many areas in Melbourne where that's happened. So by the time you'd learnt the language, the need of it in the particular school or community, it would have shifted out of that community over to another community.
They are simple issues, aren't they? But we cannot not deal with them. That's part of the good news of our historical moment. We will be driven back into our tradition if we are to survive in a world that is in fact pluralistic. We can dream dreams of Christendom if we want that Christendom is a dead dish. It's over. It is long over. And so pluralism is a fact. We have to decide whether or not we want to acknowledge a tradition or not. And if we do, will have both good and bad news for every culture, including our own. That is, there will be a critique of domination by the God who is not identified with any cultural formation, but who is identified with the poor in every cultural formation. And this to me opens up all kinds of exciting avenues for theology and mission and witness and spirituality. And it mostly raises more questions than answers. But that's okay. That's where we are. And we've got to be walking together with these kinds of questions. They're hard, difficult questions. Let us not be too quick to have answers. Let us also acknowledge that we have a tradition that, oddly enough, tells us when the Spirit descends, everybody is speaking in different tongues. What a nice motif.